and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm from the OECD. The little biography says that I head the Innovative Learning Environments project, which has been running now for about the last 6 or 7 years or so, and is coming to an end, and it's from that I would like to base my presentation, and do basically 3 things. First of all, to present some of the main concepts and frameworks that have emerged from this international study. Secondly, to talk about learning leadership, which has been a particular focus and resulted in a volume. I have 2, which I'm very happy to give away so that I don't take them back to Paris. I have 2 with me. I would have brought more, but it's getting heavier and heavier. But there's a particular analysis which I will talk to in the middle part of my talk. And then thirdly, to address a draft tool that we developed based on these concepts and the learning leadership work that is still in draft form, but which we think is already a practical tool for reflection at both the micro and the meso and macro levels. So that might be very relevant to our considerations, given the focus on tools, focus on developing practical applications. So, first of all, core concept. These are, you have to turn, you have to be flexible. First of all, the concepts, the project, the ILE project, and we basically, it's had 3 main foci, and those 3 foci are in some sense the organization of the work, but they're more than that. They're actually the philosophy underpinning the project, and the first one was very much to focus on learning research. In work on innovative learning environments, we felt an important place to start, an important point of departure was to really get a handle on learning research and what we understand about learning and how that informs the design of learning environments and what therefore that means for leadership. And that resulted in a volume called The Nature of Learning that was published in 2010. Secondly, we felt it was very important to actually see what innovative learning environments might look like. And we gathered with about 25 different countries, different systems, about 125 innovative learning environments that were submitted to us. Some we didn't accept, but we kept about 125, so that we were actually looking at obviously a tiny sample of cases, but nevertheless we were immersing ourselves in what innovative learning environments look like. But that had another important feature of our project. We were working directly with innovators, we were working directly with countries. So this wasn't just a desk job in Paris of looking around, scanning the horizon. We were very keen to actually engage with innovations going on in different systems, and that was a feature of both the second strand of work, we call the innovative cases strand, but also the third strand, which has been very much about how do we move beyond isolated, exceptional innovation towards policy, towards strategy, for going to some kind of bigger scale, sharing, growing, sustaining at larger scale. So that is, in a sense, both a project outline, but it's also a philosophy. It's about how do we move from understanding learning to looking at inspiring cases to thinking about growing and sustaining at some kind of scale. So that's where we came from, and the Leadership for Learning book is, I would see, as part of that third strand, and we're working on our final reports now, so they're not yet available. Those are the 2 main volumes from the first and second, The Nature of Learning and Innovative Learning Environments. And so from The Nature of Learning, we had contributions from eminent learning scientists, from Europe and North America in particular. And we asked them to focus on what their area of research adds up to for the design of learning environments. But having done that, we realized that there was a risk that this was a very interesting book with 12 chapters, but that you had to read all the 12 chapters to have a sense of what the implications might be. So we felt it was extremely important to move to a quite different level of synthesis and of what we call the transversal conclusions and principles that ran right through all those different contributions. And so we came up with 7 main principles that we think define what learning environments should be really aiming at. And some of them sound pretty obvious, but actually when you add them all up, they do not very well describe many of our schools. So there's a sense in which they're obvious, another sense in which they are, I think, very helpful to really define what the challenge is. And the first one is really about making learning central and learner engagement central, and of defining learning environments as places where the learners come to understand themselves very much as learners. What they're doing actively when they're in, say, school is that they're learning, and they understand what they're doing when they're learning. The second one is about the social nature of learning. Again, that might seem pretty obvious to us who are, say, researchers, but actually a lot of our thinking is based on a very isolated individual understanding of what learning is about, of what goes on inside individuals' heads. But the understanding actually is that learning is something very social, depends on interaction, and is often best done collaboratively in groups. Not always. It's not a kind of dictum that it has to be collaborative, it has to be done in groups. Nevertheless, that is very important. That it should be very highly attuned to motivation and emotion. The flip side of cognitive development is the emotions that lie behind that, and not paying attention to that side, the motivations, the positive motivations, the negative, the turn-offs, is actually to very strongly influence the success of the learning that goes on. These two are, in a sense, two sides of the same coin, very much about being sensitive to individual differences. Learners come into learning, into schools, with very different baggage and prior knowledge and understandings, and that is a very important factor to take on board. And what the regime then is, should very much recognize that and be demanding for all learners, no coasting, no one lost, but without excessive overload. No point in trying to push more and more in. Assessments are very important. Assessment is a key aspect of learning, knowing where we are, but it needs to be very consistent with what we're trying to do, as opposed to something else, something that goes on as another activity, as opposed to improving and feeding into learning. And we stress the importance of horizontal connectedness, the connections to be made between individual learning episodes and the larger ambitions, the connections between the different subjects, the connections between the learning that goes on throughout the learner trajectory, that was being talked about that yesterday afternoon, and the learning that goes on in school and out of school. So the importance of making those connections, and that they all should be aimed at, rather than saying, well, I'll try first, second, and fifth, that all those 7, we think, importantly define the challenge. So that is, I think, actually quite a radical agenda, even though some of the principles are, in some sense, unsurprising. Now, the framework that we developed, and this was very much part of looking at all those cases, the framework that we developed, we deliberately didn't do it in terms of schools and classrooms. In other words, we wanted to have a conceptual apparatus and a framework which was not defined in terms of schools, classrooms, the institutions of school systems. And we felt very important to do for 2 reasons. One is because schools and classrooms and systems are actually institutions. They're not about the organization of learning. And if we want to put learning at the center, we need concepts, we need terminology, we need approaches that are rooted in learning itself. That was one reason. The other reason becomes clearer and clearer, that is that increasingly we're learning out of school as well as in school. So therefore, we need concepts and frameworks which are more comprehensive than assuming that what we're talking about are always schools and classrooms. And this was the framework that we came up with. Time doesn't allow me to go into it in detail, but it's basically, it has at the core what we called the pedagogical core, which is about 4 elements and dynamics and connectors between those elements. The 4 elements you can see: the educators, the learners, the content, and the resources. And resources, we mean primarily the learning resources. And the connectors, the pedagogy and the organization. In the OECD volume, we were talking particularly about the way in which learners are grouped, the way in which educators work together in different ways other than simply the single teacher, single classroom model, the way in which time is used, and of course pedagogy and assessment itself, the different pedagogies, the different options that are opened up. So that's the, if you like, the pedagogical core. That's the circle. Secondly, we drew attention to the very important, here's learning leadership down here, to, if you like, the way in which the learning environment can become itself formative. So not just formative assessment as something that individual teachers do in their classes, but the extent to which schools, organizations, learning environments are formative in the sense that there's leadership, there are strategies for changing that pedagogical core, there's evidence from the learning that takes place, and that feeds back in a cycle through the learning leadership. So that cycle we think is very important, and I'll come back to that in terms of the tool that we developed. I think also that in any powerful contemporary learning environment today, there needs to be very much an openness to different partners outside of the traditional schools. So we've highlighted some that were featured quite strongly in the cases, the 125, well, there were 40 case studies and another 80 or so, that featured very strongly. Very strong links to family and communities in some, a variety of different higher education, cultural organizations, and of course, and absolutely critically, perhaps more important than either of those, although I think family is absolutely a key partner, are other learning environments. In other words, the networking, the learning communities, that is, the learning environment itself is not something closed within a school, but is actually is something much more, if you like, biological than that. It has its boundaries beyond the simple institutional boundaries of schools. And this, in a sense, defines what we think are really the four, summarizing that framework, we can do it in 4 conclusions, which themselves are a kind of an agenda for learning leadership. That that there should be innovation of the pedagogical core itself, looking at how those different elements and how those different dynamics can be innovated as part of innovation and as part of a strong focus on 21st century learning. But there should be engagement in that design, redesign, formative cycle in which leadership is absolutely critical. That there needs to be the extension of capacity, professional capacity, through partnership. And at the core of all that, those learning principles, the 7 that I outlined, we think that that is absolutely at the center. It's not just how, it's what, and the what is, as far as we're concerned, those learning principles. Now, as far as learning leadership is concerned, which is the second part of what I want to talk about, just that gives a very quick overview of what we brought together. We had Jim's brain, very much an analysis focusing, and his language, his metaphor was, there's been too much focus on the schoolhouse and not enough on what actually goes on inside the schoolhouse. But his chapter, I think, is very interesting. John Macbeth, his chapter focusing on learning settings outside of schools, to come back to the earlier theme, and have we really grasped the nature of leadership and the challenge of leadership when either we're talking about non-formal learning settings or hybrids which involve both, if you like, formal and non-formal schools working with other partners in other settings. Clive Dimmock and his colleagues proposed the backward mapping. He's not the first one to do that, but to see learning leadership in that way. Different examples from different active members of the ILE international community, and you can see them there. And this work was conducted very closely with Catalonia, and hence we had quite a strong focus on Catalonia in the book, and I think that's a very interesting chapter. So we used in the overview that Louise Stoll and I wrote. We wrote it around the why, the what, the who, the where, and the when. We felt that gave us quite a powerful, very simple framework, but it reflects what I've just said in terms of why leadership, why learning leadership, the who, looking beyond the school principal, but also the school principal and senior management being very important. The how in terms of learning and different ways of extending capacity, the where and the when, and particularly the where, as in John Macbeth's chapter, of broadening beyond simply schools. I could talk a lot about that, but obviously I can't. These are just some of the concluding orientations that we came to in at the end of that chapter. The importance of creating conditions for 21st century learning and of making that the core of leadership practice. The fact that learning leadership is very much about innovation and creativity and often takes a lot of courage. That it models and nurtures 21st century professionalism. That is, it itself is very much about inquiry and learning and not just expecting others to do that. But the importance of social connectedness, the leadership is by definition something interactive and is something connected and does involve wider professional learning communities. That it does involve non-formal, and particularly I think that we're talking about complex, multi-level leadership, not simply managing a school or heading a school. By the way, in the book we talked about leadership and management. It's a theme that came up yesterday. And Per Tronsmo is there. He wrote a contribution to that also, very much in line with what we said, which was that we weren't seeing leadership as somehow in contradistinction to management. You need the leadership, but then you do need the management to back that up, to sustain, to follow up, to implement. So it's really, the distinction is more like Jim Spillane said, between are we talking about leadership and management focused strongly on learning, or are we talking about leadership and management, which is essentially about maintaining the institution. And our focus very much on the first. So I have about 5 minutes, I think, is that right? A bit more, good, so I'm doing quite well. We're on the leadership tool. So we devised a tool, and I'll say at the end a little bit more about how we think this might be played out in 2015. But we started very much with the framework developed through the ILE program. And we think that we were thinking in terms of a tool that would actually ask questions of people at the school level, the micro level, and also ask questions at different levels, at a more meso level and macro level. We think it's relevant for all of them. And the first is very much about who is involved in learning leadership, who is engaging. what kinds of visions and strategies about learning are guiding the school, if this is being used in the school context, the way in which those strategies are being implemented and how it's being done, and the way in which professional learning is integral to that, the nature of evidence capture, how are we following what's happening in a formative way. We're very keen on formative assessment. If we're talking about formative organizations, how are we knowing what we're doing? And then how is that being fed back into the learner leadership? Again, the notion of that cycle of vision, strategy, evidence, and feedback. So that, we think, provides a tool. Now, these are on each of the 5. We devised a set of questions. For example, on the who, we think these are interrogations that can be very helpfully asked within a school context. If a school or a network of schools is thinking about leadership, the question about the who of learning leadership is a very important one. How wide is the distribution? The extent to which students are involved in leadership also. But obviously I can't read all that, and you wouldn't want me to. Similarly, questions around vision and strategy, the extent to which there is a vision or project, and how that was devised, and how that has been revised in the light of evidence, putting those into practice. So these are all essentially questions that we think can be usefully developed and answered by practitioners, by schools, by different partners engaged in the question of how the evidence on learning, evidence of success is being fed back, the extent to which that happens. So the wording isn't so important, although one feedback we've already had is that if it's aimed at practitioners, this seems a very academic wording that we've used. We've taken it more from our own reports, and we're going to have to work at translating that into terms and questions that are very readily understandable. That's not talking down to anybody, it's a recognition that our own jargon we're often blind to it. So just to say, that's a kind of tool. We think that can be adapted to other levels. It's not simply for use in schools. And that might be, say we were talking more at the policy level, agencies that are there to develop leadership, policies that are aimed at really transforming learning in schools, that this tool can be used there too, but focusing both on the extent to which the vision, the strategy, that understanding is informing policy itself, and the extent to which policy strategies are fostering the capacity to ask those kinds of questions that might be there. So we think that it's a tool that can be adapted at different levels. So finally, just to say, we're working towards a handbook. We're working towards a final report, which is very much about implementation and change, but we're also working towards a handbook, which is for practitioners, and we think that it can very usefully cover the different areas of the ILE program, that is to materials and tools based on the learning principles, framework on learning leadership, on evaluation of innovative learning, and on transformational change. Summarizing some of the key concepts accessibly from the ILE work, and also presenting the draft tools. And we will be looking to field test those in the first half of 2015, getting feedback, and then finalization and publication, along with the final ILE report on that third strand, implementation and change. Thank you very much.